recording button. All right, thanks so much. All right, and maybe if we can get a spotlight, Connor, and we can get that going. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining. Again, we're asking folks to drop in the chat your name, your organization, where you're located, and what brings you here. My name is Selena Feliciano, and I am the REFOCUS campaign coordinator at the Energy Democracy Project. I'm located on Chochenyo Ohlone land, also known as West Oakland, California. And I'm so honored to be kicking off today's meeting because we have a really special panel planned today. You might be wondering, why is the Energy Democracy Project hosting this conversation? Well, there are so many different reasons that I could list today, but to start off, I'm going to share some slides that hopefully can color our conversation a little bit and kick us off on the same page. The project is a collaborative of about 40 organizations that are spread all across the country, putting power back in the hands of the people. And the REFOCUS campaign is about stories about you and me and our neighbors, and how real, everyday people across the country are reimagining the ways we organize our lives and livelihoods to support the health and well-being of our communities and ecosystems. During our first meeting in person in 4 years in November, we had a powerful address from Noura El Marzuki, today's moderator, making the ties between struggles that spread all across the globe. As part of the REFOCUS campaign, we recognize that the same perils of colonialism, of imperialism, of military force, and of othering at play in Gaza currently, as we speak, have been in play in Puerto Rico and in low-income Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities all across the country. We've got folks that are spread across many miles on this call, and today we're honing in on these links as they relate to energy and its ties to land, military, extraction, and control. Usually, when we kick off conversations around energy and REFOCUS, we talk about our homes. Your home might be city, countryside, or coast. And here, we have pictured homes in the West Bank in Palestine, a home in Maui, Hawaii, and a home in Puerto Rico. And all of these homes use power that keeps your homes warm in the winter, cool in the summertime, and safe in a changing climate. We all deserve this power because it's essential to life. But for far too long, there are entities that have thought otherwise. And as part of the REFOCUS campaign, we're pulling back the veil of the ways in which centralized power, specifically control over decision-making of energy, is held in the hands of a few, while the rest of us are left to suffer. Centralized power here in the so-called U.S., power companies and authorities have written the rules on the cost, reliability, and safety of our electricity. Energy is a driver of extraction and a method of control as a geopolitical instrument. These are the two elements that I'm going to focus on today to help make the links with what's going on in Gaza. Again, energy as a driver of extraction and a method of control at play all across the globe. In Puerto Rico, we see a coal power plant run by the company AES now seeking a government bailout. AES produces an average of 800 tons of coal ash per day. And for nearly 2 decades, that ash was dumped into a mountainous pile of toxic waste that reached over 12 stories high, blowing into people's homes and nearby schools, harming and extracting from the land, people, and ecology. In Gaza, we see how the Israeli government announced in October during the first days of the bombing that month that it had granted licenses to 6 companies for gas exploration off of Palestine's coast. And in 2019, the UN estimated over $500 billion of unrealized oil and gas potential in the West Bank and off the shore of Gaza. This extraction is never ending and excused under the guise of quote unquote necessity that communities never consented to. And on the front of control, We see how centralized power authorities have been negligent in the care of the grid in Puerto Rico. Hurricane Maria in 2017 resulted in the death of more than 3,000 people, with many of those deaths the direct result of a lack of electricity that left residents without power for medical equipment, food, water, and shelter for months after the hurricane. And during the early stages of the siege on Gaza in October, Israel shut off the supply of electricity, and the sole remaining power station, as the main supplier, ran out of fuel on the 11th of October. But the history of control and blackouts span much further. The speakers on today's call are going to be sharing their stories and bringing to light the ways in which we have power in reimagining new futures. For energy justice activists and advocates on today's call, may you take this torch and keep the conversation going on the blatant genocide happening in Gaza. Join us in acknowledging complicity and silence and the responsibility we all hold to recognize that our struggles and opportunities for new futures and liberation must transcend the fallacy of geopolitical borders. I'll pause there and I'll hand the mic over to Noura. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Hi, y'all. My name's Noura Al-Marzoui. I use she, her pronouns, and I am here wearing the hat of Emerald Cities for Emerald Cities Collaborative as a senior energy democracy, but never leaving behind my roles in the Philly Palestine Coalition, as well as the Lela Legislador Collective here in Philadelphia, Lene Lenape Land. I'm an urbanist. I really look at the intersections of project-based curriculum education, arts, culture, energy, climate justice, and community development. I'm here today to combine all of my hats together in moderating a really wonderful conversation here with our guests. And I'm just going to introduce our guests briefly and invite them to share a little bit more about each one of them before we dive into our conversation. So we're really lucky to have Vivian Sansour with us today, who is a storyteller, an artist, a researcher, and conservationist. As Selena said earlier, Vivian founded the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library as part of the work with local farmers. Vivian is a culinary historian and enthusiastic cook who works to bring threatened varieties back to the dinner table to become part of our living culture rather than a relic of the past. And I invite Vivian to share a couple more words about yourself. You're on mute, Vivian.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, I was talking to myself. My name is Vivian, and as Nora said, thank you all for having me here. And like Nora said, I work a lot with seed conservation, and I swim often in the world of working with farmers in the field, particularly around issues with land access, but also how do we, in this world, continue to cultivate our ancestral seeds in our ancestral land. But obviously, when we talk about land, we're also talking about energy all the time. Not only is land energy itself, but all the elements that are all actually contested, being from Palestine, where I'm from. And so water, for example, and electricity and access to all kinds of other things is always limited. So we're always having to be creative and navigating how we do all this. But you asked me to say a few things about myself, and I end up going into the deeper conversation. But yeah, I work in these worlds, and I currently live upstate New York because I teach at Bard College, a course that is a hybrid course between Palestine and New York, and it is focused on ecology, art, and also the human and non-human relatives.
Thank you so much, Vivian. I'd like to now introduce Natalia Ibrahim Abu Farah Davila. Natalia is a consultant, coordinator, and assistant of projects and programs with social, ecological, and cultural impacts in communities in the archipelago of Boricua, known as Puerto Rico. She has experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, working in customer service, project and program management, operational and administrative management, and event production. She supports and assists individuals, artists, entrepreneurs, organizations, local businesses, and community projects in having a positive social impact and solving real problems in an innovative, creative, and sustainable way that integrates individuals and communities in the development and implementation process. Natalia, can you tell us a little more about yourself?
Hi, everyone. My pronouns are she and they. I'm so happy that I'm here having this important conversation. To share a little bit of me, I'm Boricua and Palestinian. I live in Rio Piedras, San Juan, which is considered the capital of Borinque, Puerto Rico, as you maybe know, the archipelago. Yeah, as Nora said, I work with individuals, communities, and different organizations, as well as small business projects, but also creative projects to pretty much change the landscape of Boriquen, which has been struggling under colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, as well as many other oppressive and injustice systems. And yeah, that's what I want to leave it there, you know, not go too deep.
Thank you, Natalia. Our last guest is Patrick Bigger. Patrick is the research director at the Climate and Community Project. His scholarly research focused on the creation and regulation of new financial mechanisms by governments, financiers, and NGOs that try to reconcile capitalism's environmental and economic contradictions. Patrick, can you share a little bit more about your work?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nora, and thanks to all of y'all for being here and to the organizers for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be on such a cool panel on such important topics. So the Climate and Community Project is a climate justice think tank based in the United States. About 80% of the work that we do with many of the organizations that are represented by folks on this call revolves around transformative climate solutions in the domestic U.S. context. We also have a significant amount of research around, we think of as global systems and policy, particularly building on work that I'd done previously as an academic on the role of the U.S. military in the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis. Oftentimes we reduce all things environmental to climate, but we know there's a biodiversity crisis, there's a food crisis, there's a soil crisis, and understanding of how all of these are different manifestations of the way that capital and capitalist states have organized our social and ecological worlds is an important step to confronting those challenges. And I'm looking forward to talking about some of the ways that we confront those with my fellow panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And before diving into this conversation, I'd really like to take a moment to remind people that it is very important to take care of yourself. I think the conversation we're going to have will be both difficult as well as inspiring. And so make sure you're taking care of yourself throughout this conversation. So let's get started. I'd like to really try to get set the landscape a little bit. Why are we having this conversation? Selena sort of gave us a little bit of a bit of an intro, right, about why Puerto Rico to Palestine. And I'd like to hand over the floor to Natalia to kind of speak a little bit more about what are those direct connections between Puerto Rico and Palestine that you see, especially in the work that you do.
Thank you, Nora. Well, just to name a few, because it's a very there's a lot to address between Palestine and Puerto Rico. First of all, we can see a lot of intersections between Puerto Rico and Palestine. One of them is the extraction of resources, the manipulation of an erasure of history between communities, and also imposed narratives, dismantling of health and education and energy systems throughout the colonial infrastructure, hosting of neoliberalism policies, also targeting all sovereign projects or organizing, and that brings, repression and continuous violent dismantling of any type of organization. We also see debt as a strategy to force displacement. We also see the imposition of, let's say, how can I say it? Let me talk about Puerto Rico a little bit. We see the imposition of a fiscal board under the approval of La Ley that is widely known as Promesa in 2016 under the administration of Obama. And we can see that as well in Palestine, as they imposed the Palestinian Authority, because they act very similarly, and they act as a dictatorship in so many occasions and in so many ways throughout, living conditions. We also see disaster capitalism as used to implement policies, but also to implement a market that doesn't really drive to develop any clean energy strategies, or even to imagine them. And those are only one of the mentions, because at the end of the day, when we talk about Puerto Rico and Palestine, we cannot ignore the role of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and other systems of repressive that are very injustice. And at the end of the day, we have to talk about the role of the United States and how it contributes, not only monetary, but also designing a repressive system that still holds in place. And sometimes we are complicit without not applying a decolonial approach. And those are some of the ways that I can see the connection between Puerto Rico and Palestine. There's a very, that if there's any Spanish-speaking folks here, there's a very digging and also very deep article written by Shalene Rodriguez and Ruth Noelia Figueroa Covert, which is called La Sombra de Palestina in Puerto Rico, which is the shadow of Palestine in Puerto Rico. And in this article, not only they talk about how the imposed of the fiscal board, but also the approval of laws such as Ley 2022, which is now under Ley 60, actually works as, and it's similar to the Homestead law from 1862, which basically displaced the indigenous and native population by practically giving to settlers and coming people from United States or from other foreign places more rights and more possibility of sustaining life in the archipelago. And you can see that in Palestine, of course, in a very more violent way, and occupation in Palestine is, as we can see with the ongoing genocide in Gaza and throughout occupied Palestine, we can see that military intervention and military occupation is also a common ground, because even though the military left Vieques, which is part of the archipelago, I believe it's in 2003, occupation never left in Puerto Rico, and we can see how it still acts similar as it acts in Palestine. Of course, not in the same violent and systematically way, but it is present. We also can draw in history that Puerto Rico was also a victim of bombardment of bombs from the military occupation in Puerto Rico, which was used to repress nationalists and independent movements in Puerto Rico. And we can see that in Palestine, the repression and the continuous erasure of any type of organization or movement, it actually makes life unsustainable in both places and in both populations and definitely geographically locations. Those are the ones. For me, the experience of being Boricua in Palestine is one that I can draw a lot of connections, and it's one that from very little into as long as I can remember, I quickly understood that my existence, I apologize for that, my dog. Give me a minute. Sorry for that, folks. Sorry for that. So I quickly understood that my existence relies on my resistance. And every time that I imagine a possibility, I have to break a ceiling. And after I break that ceiling, another ceiling imposes itself on me. So my future always depends, and it's always, I'm sorry, I'm thinking in Spanish and then translating in English. It always depends on the possibility of living under such conditions. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has any questions, or Nora, if you want to address anything of what I said.
Yeah, no, I think what you're doing is sort of setting the stage at these general kind of ways that we're connecting. And something I wanted to pull out that's really related to this energy democracy space is what you said around targeting all sovereign projects and organizing, right? And the ways even in which, like in Puerto Rico, the land and solar are pitted against, agriculture and solar are almost pitted against each other, right? And in Palestine, we see solar panels are being bombed, right? And so Egyptians are trying to get generators across the border in order to source this power. And so we're really seeing the ways in which folks are, no matter what, resilient in organizing, right? And creating those opportunities to try to provide in a community sourced way the basic necessities of what is needed. I'd like to take the topic on the military to Patrick. Can you please speak to your research around climate change and genocide and the military that you spoke about earlier in Palestine?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nora and Natalia, for setting the scene. I'll try to keep this relatively high level. I'm happy to discuss specifics. I think there's also going to be some links that Connor is going to pop in the chat for sources for what I'm about to say. So for the last 7 or 8 years, one of my projects has been looking at the role of the U.S. military in the climate crisis. Quantifying, we did a lot of Freedom of Information Act requesting to understand the extent of the U.S. military's fuel use. And the most high-level takeaway from that that stream of research is that the US military is the largest single institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet, and has been for quite some time. Done quite a lot of research and writing on the history of the US military in creating and securing the global fossil fuel economy, going back to the US and UK Navy in the early 20th century when they switched from coal to oil, which created a large guaranteed demand for new sources of liquid fossil fuels and refining capacity, that of course also needed to be present around the globe so that the US and UK military could, refuel their ships in the maintenance of global empire. And that's a set of geographical relationships that was, sort of already set in place through the expansion of the British and then American Empire, the North American Empire, I should say, and over the course of the 19th, 18th centuries, that has become firmly entrenched in the global, both political order, but also materially rooted in space, as we can see through the US's maintenance of at least 750 offshore military bases around the world, including many in Puerto Rico, as well as if you look at a map of where all these installations are, they're very clearly sort of line up very neatly with global oil shipping routes. So the link between the US military and the climate crisis can't be understated. And in terms of how that is playing out in Palestine, along with some colleagues at British universities, we tried to quantify the climate impacts of the Israeli invasion of Gaza over the first 60 days and then across a couple of other timeframes. And now, before I say this, I think one important caveat is that the kind of diffuse carbon impacts of the genocide in Gaza are not the most important reason that we should be demanding a permanent, durable, just ceasefire, but it is one consideration, maybe if we're talking to more purely climate-oriented folks who might say, okay, well, what does this have to do with me or the work that I do? And we know that Gazans in particular, but all Palestinians were already extremely vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis before the current round of genocide kicked off. And one of the ways that we have summarized this is that apartheid is incompatible with climate justice, but inevitable without it. And this is the use of scarce, a very scarce amount of carbon budget we have left for war, in the words of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, said it was an idiotic way to spend our remaining carbon budget. And I think that is a really nice way of putting it. And so what we found in terms of the impacts, the environmental impacts of the Israeli incursion to Gaza thus far, is that in the first 60 days of the war, the emissions, 99% of which accrue to the US and Israel, were more than 20 extremely climate vulnerable countries. The vast majority of those emissions occurred as a result of Israeli bombing raids, and even more so because of US supply flights sending material, basically weaponry, to Israel. 45% of those 300,000-ish tons of emissions were a result of US supplying the apartheid state of Israel. And then the real big number, if we think about just the carbon dimensions of this genocide, will be in rebuilding Gaza. This is similar to what we see in war zones around the world. It's very easy to destroy things. It's very difficult to build them back up, including the environmental dimensions of that, where rebuilding Gaza, even to its previously absolutely untenable state, would entail carbon emissions along the lines of what New Zealand emits in a year. So we're getting into emissions figures that really are significant and were completely avoidable. But now at this stage, we have to talk about how to stop the killing first and foremost, how to reduce global emissions such that vulnerable communities in Palestine and Puerto Rico and around the world are not subjected to further, we can think of climate change as incurring both fast violence in the form of these, discrete extreme events, but also the slow violence of drought, of increased heat, of unpredictability that make it very difficult for people to live fulfilling, flourishing lives as the climate changes as a result of the decisions of powerful, unaccountable, often murderous institutions.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I think it is important to stress that it is not just about the environmental costs, it is also about the human costs. And recognizing how this environmental cost is exactly a reason and a source of organizing, actually, to be able to find those ways. And thinking back to what Natalia said, right? Part of this organizing around this is making those connections, not just from Puerto Rico to Palestine, right? But the connections around the environment, the connections around displacement, the connections around water, access to water, air, land, and how it's all tied together, right? For the greater liberation of us all. And so with that, I'd like us to maybe get a little bit more specific into talking about land. And the destruction, the sterilization, and the stories that are being erased in the process. And so I'd like to turn the floor over to Vivian to speak a little bit to land extraction in Palestine and how that impacts access to food and local business.
Yeah, thanks, Noura, and everybody. Obviously, like it's really hard to talk about this today in even the same ways we talked about it a few months ago. Even though we've imagined some of what's happening today. As a kid, I always wondered, like, why have they not killed us all already? Like, why do they keep us alive? And I think uh, also because as a kid who grew up on this land that you're talking about, um, the relationship with land is so significantly different. So I just want to acknowledge that when we talk about land, I'm learning more and more how we don't always mean the same thing. So even people who identify as liberals and environmentalists, they will still talk about land as a commodity, as something that you use and you consume and you take from and you um, design in the way you want to design it, and you calculate what you can get from it. And we, of course, uh, relate to land as private property, something you buy. Um, in Palestine, if I may just give a little bit like of a historic context, the relationship to land is very different. In fact, even before the Israeli occupation, before the establishment of the State of Israel, we had a lot of land that is called Masha' land. And Masha' land is land that basically doesn't belong to anybody. It belongs to everybody. And people in different villages would sort of arrange and agree who's going to grow what this year and what land. And like you could just go and literally uh, you know put crop in a piece of land. When we talk about masha was a lot of land. Not that there weren't people with private property, but it wasn't the idea of it is very different, like because there's so much land accessible to everybody. And when Israel was established, they made sure to get rid of all masha' land. I mean, to get rid of all masha' land, that means to get rid of a lot of land and call it state land. And that was a form also of confiscating more land or making land even more inaccessible to people. And so when we talk also about land and why making land inaccessible to indigenous people, to any people, it's a way of also severing people from their food source, severing people from their lifestyle, severing people from their ability to have roots, to have connection, or to even survive as just in terms of like eating. So in Palestine, also the change in how land was suddenly spoken about and treated resulted also in the way we are able and what we are able to grow and what we are able to eat. So our diet, for example, which traditionally was very much based on foraging, especially in not entirely based on foraging, but a big part of particularly our winter food is based on foraging. Like I can go on a mountain and I can smell things and follow them and know where to go to get it. So if you throw me in a mountain, which is a land that I have relationship with, I can fully survive because I actually know the land. Like I know the rocks, I know what they do, I know what these plants do when. And maybe I'm talking too much about this context, but I think it's important to understand because when we're talking about land, we're not talking about private property. We're talking about literally a living, beating, heart beating being that has a whole culture. You know, also when we talk about land, we talk about soil, and soil is a whole world of living beings. And there's also a relationship of trust with soil because it is the living being that gives you your livelihood. And this is not so since we've been severed from our lands, from our mountains, our foodways have changed. And this brings me back to, not to take too much time, but to what Natalia was talking about in terms of connection to Puerto Rican or any other place really in the world. Because while things are very specific that I'm talking about in Palestine, and it has its, you know, obviously particular issues, it is a problem and a story all over the world because it is right now a fight between people of land, people of soil, people who love soil and want to stay connected to soil, and people who see soil as just another commodity. And we see this played out in the neoliberal policies that Natalia mentioned, which are imposed by the American neoliberal movement, where, you know, farmers are told, you know, you don't need soil even. You know, if soil for them is just a thing that they use to hold the plant instead of, like I said, a living being. And then, oh, we'll bring you all the other inputs to the farm and you buy it from us, including seed, fertilizer, even pollinators. Israel, for example, the way they do with Palestinian farmers is there's a push to obviously sever people from land, just the way it happened in Puerto Rico. And by severing people from land, people are pushed into neoliberal models of agribusiness. So you have whole villages within only the last 10 years, for example, that have turned from soil and sun-based agriculture to greenhouse agriculture, which is very chemical intensive agriculture. And so you see cancer cases in rural Palestine, which were the healthiest places to live, on the rise. You have all of these in the, because we have no access to open space, to our valleys, for example, basic crops that are very much things we cultivated for our daily food, our cultural food, from hummus, chickpeas to sesame, for example, and wheat, which Palestine is part of the Fertile Crescent, which is the center of diversity for wheat and barley. So the whole world eats wheat and barley as a product of what our ancestors developed in terms of a crop variety. And yet today, all of the above mentioned is imported, be it imported from places like Turkey or some some of the seed varieties have changed, and now we grow Israeli varieties. And this is very dangerous, because when we talk about land, we're not just talking about where you plant trees and that's it. Also, land is it's a place where you engage in co-creation with plant life, with human life. So when we talk about ecology and the environment or energy or whatever, we're talking about all of them together. And so not being able to access our land, be it predominantly right now, we are struggling a lot, even more than we did before. And with the genocide, it's becoming even way more aggressive, with settlers coming down from the settlements that they built along the hills, again, our mountains, because they build settlements on our food, literally. And they come down with machine guns. And we've had this year farmers, like many years before, but this year even more, who were shot and killed while trying to harvest their olives, for example. But other than olives, part of why we don't have sorry, my battery is dying. But I'm talking too long, but just to say, the violence of settlers basically is a form of severing us from our land. Of course, land confiscation is another form of severing us from our land, and the deprivation of water. And so we're having to build more cisterns, but even to build cisterns is dangerous. But really, walking down the street in Palestine is dangerous these days. And so I don't know. Maybe I'm not fully answering the question, but to say it's very painful to talk about land right now, and any intellectual conversation about it is very difficult, because I feel all over the world. Well, first, I feel we are part of the land. So even though I'm here across the world from Palestine, literally my body feels, and I'm sure most Palestinians feel, the pain of the land right now, because we are an extension of it. But also to understand that in the world, whether you're in Burikan or anywhere, it does feel like we're living in the remnants of the world, the remnants of land, the remnants of nature. And so I think even within the conversation about energy and all the great attempts of all of us to do conservation work, there is still something we're missing, because our world is in hospice. And I think we're being called for greater imagination, that I'm not sure we're seeing what we need to see yet.
Thank you so much, Vivian. There's so many things that we can really pull out from what you've said. And I think one of the highlights is really thinking about that justice element. And I think this has been brought up multiple times, is it's not just about the environment, it's really about our relationship with each other and the ecology in which we thrive, right? And when we talk about things like a just transition, when we talk about things like a just transition and moving into a regenerative economy and things like that, what it really is going back to indigenous practices, right? It isn't creating something new. It is, occupation and imperialism has cut off and continues to cut off and sever our ties, as you said, Vivian, from our land, from our history. And Mindy Fullilove talks about that a little bit when she talks about root shock and the ways in which forced displacement in the United States. She uses the Brooklyn Dodgers Stadium as an example in the history of that, to talk about the psychological impacts of removal from the land and erasure of history and physical memory in public space, right? And so, it's really important to consider all of these different elements and how they truly connect together. And the point of storytelling as well, And I want to kind of take the floor over to Natalia to kind of talk about how extraction and control play a role in shaping stories around the land of your people and informing your work as having a foot in both places.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Vivian and Patrick. A lot of powerful knowledge that has been shared. So being Boricua and Palestinian, and sometimes not even, sometimes I say I'm Palestinian Boricua, is because sometimes it's difficult to choose where I'm from, because I feel the connection to the land, to both places. And part of my decolonization process was first to acknowledge that I had that lack of connection to land, not because of choice, but by imposition. And that drove me to study ecological praxis and going to indigenous practice here in Puerto Rico, working in farms, working in local gardens, and really understanding by practicing and by being connected to the land, how extraction and control is being set, and how it really, without even my acknowledgement right before the past few years, it's been, I don't know, I think it's been 4 years, me being on this work, is that I understood how it's by practicing and being very connected to land is how I understood how extraction works, and how controlled I was, and how communities are controlled in Puerto Rico. So definitely acknowledging extraction and control have always been my habitat, not only in Borinquen, but also in Palestine. Nora, can you remind me the question? It was how it plays a role in my work?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your work and how extraction and control sort of shape the stories around the land of your people. Yeah, and yeah, a little bit more about your work around this.
So yeah, so part of going to, before I go talking about my work, I acknowledge that I had to do a lot of work on myself, and that I had to really understand that I'm also part of nature, and nature is me, and I'm nature. And that really shaped my work, and pretty much changed my perspective. I've also kind of, I would say, victim of this mentality of profit and entrepreneurial kind of mindset. And I designed a lot of, and also kind of developed a lot of business initiatives. But as I was doing them, I confronted myself with the lack of the participation of communities, and the lack of the opinion, and how I was imposing pretty much a framework of profit. And I was complicit in extraction. So I applied my decolonial process to myself. And by doing that, I also applied it to my work. And that's when I kind of diverted to nonprofit. And of course, we can talk a lot of, that complex. But in that context, I was able to have more impact, and starting to kind of creating spaces through dialogue, and in between those conversations with community members, but also business entrepreneurs, leaders from the community, we kind of started to identify extraction policies, identify where we are confronting power struggles. And by doing that, we started imagining how we can change and create impact. Of course, under colonialism, we are completely dependent on certain material conditions. And that makes the work more difficult, but also it kind of by not choice, but mostly by being creative, is to use our imagination. And most of these ideas that kind of derive from these community dialogues ends up in projects that address food insecurity, environmental justice, clean energy, and energy justice, as well as recycling projects and agroecological projects and so on. And even though most of them are just on the development and designing process, they taken into account how to confront colonialism, imperialism, and of course, capitalism. Because here in the in Puerto Rico, it's difficult to raise funds. And it's difficult to even attain funds because there's a design of competing kind of competition to grants, federal grants or federal aid, and that makes it difficult to really, develop any type of project. So we depend on our local economy, which is constantly being kind of attacked in some way with these neoliberal policies, but also the impositions and the dictatorship of an unelected fiscal board. So my work right now is pretty much creating a grid of actions, but also creating a canvas of imagination when we do find solutions to most of the ceilings that pretty much a lot of indigenous and low income and communities of color are confronting, and not only in Turtle Island, but in many places around the world. Yeah, so my work has been informed not only because of who I am, but also by being diligent and practicing. Of course, I'm not perfect. It's also a process of unlearning, relearning, and learning again by doing and working with others and thinking about collective and divesting from that individualistic mindset, but also divesting from that profit mindset. And I think that applies when we're talking about environment and also talking about energy. All is interconnected. And we don't have these things and we don't work towards a collective future, we will never have a sustainable, and we are also, I think Patrick mentioned something about, but we are also driving ourselves to extinction. Yeah, that's how I think extraction should be confronted in the setting. First, let's imagine ourselves together, and how can we mobilize to organize and then abolish all of this oppressive and injustice systems that doesn't allow us to break those ceilings. Yes.
Thanks, Natalia. I think, something that I heard you say that's really important, especially when we're organizing, is this walking the talk and how we're implementing the values that we want to see within the context of the complexities of whether we're talking about, the complexities of capitalism living within that, even the complexities of a nonprofit industrial complex, right? So how are we able to think about our roles in and how we're really, step by step practicing what we preach, right? Before taking the floor to questions and answers, I'd really love for Vivian, maybe you can close us off about how your work is pushing against the destructive policies and the narratives around what land should be as a commodity, and how your actions are moving us towards a towards liberation.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalia, also for bringing up the canvas of imagination. Well, I think I should just frame that my work is really a work of grief, a lot of grief, because like also Natalia mentioned, how much we have to work on ourselves first as we try to walk the talk. And that's always challenging because we kind of have to always check in with ourselves, like where you get co-opted without your awareness, or sometimes where you get co-opted despite yourself. And to question also always, where am I being mediocre? Where am I being mediocre in my courage? Where am I being mediocre in my imagination? And I think this is really hard work sometimes, because the world, the way it's designed, is designed to, especially in the Western world, it's designed, and you're brought up and educated to be committed to mediocrity, almost like, while at the same time thinking that, oh, you're free and you have all these slogans and oh, you're living in freedom. But what's been happening recently to my people in a more intense way, even though it's been happening, has kind of highlighted to me the question that was always at the core of the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library for me, which is, how do we assert life when everything around us wants us to be dead? You know, we're not supposed to be alive. We are taught since we are born that we are shit, and that we have to also eat the shit, and that we have to be happy when we get the crumbs of our oppressor's shit, literally, and we have to look up to our oppressor somehow. And so in the journey of starting the seed library, and in the work we're still doing today, which is the work of recovering the seeds that we were told are quote unquote primitive, unnecessary, unwanted, just the way we were told we are unnecessary and unwanted. How do we allow ourselves to excavate our own beauty through the seeds? So the seeds are, of course, literally the biological heritage, but they are also an extension of us, and they also, with each seed, we have a story. You know, for example, we have wheat that's called Kaff al-Rahman, which means the palm of the merciful, for example. And so when you talk to somebody about a wheat that has this kind of name, you start to wonder about that relationship and what that means. And so you also start to wonder about your own story as a human being who comes from a heritage that has the word mercy as something to value. And so with the work we're doing, obviously we're focused a lot on food sovereignty. We are interested in inviting as many farmers and growers as we can all over Palestine. And today we are also doing this work all over the world, and particularly here in Turtle Island, to invite folks to also engage in both the journey of falling in love with these things that are dying, like the courage to fall in love with something that's dying, and at the same time to have the courage to design something new, meaning that it's true that our indigenous knowledge is of the highest value. And what's also true is our world is changing, and it's changing quite rapidly. So we're having to be better designers and more creative designers. Even with the, speaking of land, like the soil has changed so much. So even as we recover old varieties of seeds, the relationship with soil has changed, because also the soil has changed and has been poisoned and contaminated. And so and the climate is changing. So we're having to be, like I said, more creative, but also more diligent scientists in terms of like selection, figuring out what seeds can tolerate, for example, too much rain. We have varieties of what we call ba'al seeds. And these ba'al seeds, actually, we grow them in the summer with no irrigation. So with climate change, we're having rain in June, which damages our crop, actually. And so how do we now select varieties that can tolerate, can survive? And I think that is important when we talk about the liberatory work in ourselves, in our communities, because we are also having to do this work within ourselves. How do we survive under so much toxicity, under so much attack? And what do we need? What do we need? What can we do to design ways and paradigms that can help us make it through and help each other? But also, how do we kind of dismantle fully and truly the lie that we've been told all our lives that we don't matter? And actually, our greatest revolution becomes how do we take care of ourselves, but also how do we love ourselves while everybody is telling us that, you know, we not only we don't matter, like we're horrible, we're bad, we're like so I think I'll just say one short story from like the seed library, which is that this is very important for the youth, for young people, as much as it is for adults, because our generation massively failed this new generation. So we owe it to them, because now they have to be braver, they have to be more creative, they have to be more resilient. And so it's sometimes as simple as they come and you tell them the story of the wheat, and that actually our ancestors developed wheat. And you see the kids, they sit different, they talk different, because suddenly they go from this to, oh, I'm paying attention, because I'm maybe there is something worth it in me to live for and to survive for. And it sounds so basic for folks who didn't grow up under colonial world, because the question of whether your life is worth living or if your life is worth whatever was never in question. And so I don't know, I mean, so just to say that we're an extension of these seeds, and our work with seeds, even though it's about seeds, literally it's also a lot about the seeds of how we see ourselves and how we free ourselves mentally, even before we are physically free.
Thank you, Vivian. What we've been hearing today is, you know, the connection between the human disasters and the environmental disaster that we're seeing today. And it's not just about today, but it is about the long term. Recognizing the tactics that are being used to divide and conquer communities, to sever folks from their land, changing how we interact with the land and each other, and really thinking about how are we implementing and building the world we want to see, starting with ourselves, as well as emanating out into the rest of the work that we're doing. And one thing that wasn't really mentioned today that is a topic for another day is this, you know, when we're talking about climate justice and environmental justice, is the greenwashing that happens. And, you know, the ways in which, you know, there's quote unquote transition to renewable energy and sustainable products and whatever, and really ignoring once again the human impacts and the extractive nature of the production of what is happening and what is being created. So with that, I want to open the floor to questions from the audience. I know we've already got 2 here, so maybe you know, you want to think about how we organize for energy justice. You know, right now we heard a little bit about the work that Natalia and Vivian are doing around an energy and environmental justice. And so, you know, how can we organize for energy justice in a way that is effectively anti-capitalist and anti-war, which I think has been a theme amongst our conversation today. And this is for anyone. This is a question that was sent to us.
I mean, I can try to answer. How do we organize? Is the question. I don't know. For me, I'll just say that I think that going back to what um, Natalia mentioned about examining ourselves, I think is the first step. And then I think we need to also bring who we are to the struggle, meaning like there's a lot of sometimes, you know, people are so focused on, oh, what can I do, as if there's a formula. And unfortunately there isn't a formula, or fortunately there isn't a formula. But I do think we need to pay more attention to what we can bring, like where's my power, where's the thing that I'm good at, and then paying attention to what other people around us need. Like what are they needing, what are they what is it that you know, I think yeah, to pay closer attention. Even sometimes, often people don't mention their needs, but we can pay attention. And I say this because for us to organize around anything, we really need the strength and the safety of our own communities, and that's often missing. Like, you want to know that when you go out fighting, you come home and there is community. And I think the more we solidify, like as much as we resist, as much as we need to create. And I think that part is necessary, because we need these oases of life so that we can expand them. We may not be able to change the whole world, but we can create tender spaces in our communities and in our spaces, and hopefully the ones to come, they grow bigger.
I want to build off something you said, Vivian, which is paying attention to what we can bring. And some of y'all in this space might be familiar with the Climate Justice Alliance's orientation to people's orientation to a regenerative economy. And it has an image in there that, you know, is a youth pouring water into the ground with a plant, and it lays out all these different roles, right? We all have something to bring, even if it feels like it's not enough. But whether you are an expert, and we are all experts in some way, because we all have lived experiences, right? And so we might learn that maybe I'm really good in the arts and I'm part of narrative building. Maybe I'm really good at creating you know, speeches that like rile people up. I'm really good at organizing direct actions then, right? Maybe I'm doing political education. I work with youth. I facilitate workshops. So, you know, I really love the Climate Justice Alliance's image of really thinking about all of our different roles, because we all fit together in some way. That's what moves the movement forward. It's recognizing that we are not the same, and that dissimilarness actually complements each other. And, you know, also really stressing what Vivian said, which I've seen come to life in the last few months, which is creating those spaces of community care. That is part of the implementation of the values we want to see. So when we're out there fighting, when we're out there learning, when we're out there, you know, we still need a place to come back to fill up again, to go back out into the streets, to go back out in the different ways that we show up. So I just wanted to really highlight that. Thank you, Vivian, for that. Does any Natalia or Patrick, would you like to speak on this question before we move on to the next question?
I can add a few things. If Patrick doesn't mind, I don't know if he wanted to take a turn, but I have a lot in mind. Let me try to refrain. But this is a very this is a question that comes to mind every day for me, and sometimes I think I have the answer, and when I'm back, so when I'm working with communities or I have these conversations, it turns out I don't. But it opens a new window, you know, of creating another possible answer to this question. But definitely organizing, it looks different from everybody, right? And it's because of due to these material conditions imposed. And as Vivian and Nora was saying, is that you can bring yourself and you can bring your talent, and mostly you can bring yourself in the most compassionate way and most empathic and flexible way and so you have the openness to learn from others. And definitely that's kind of sometimes difficult to a lot of people living under colonialism and capitalism, imperialism, because of that psychology kind of hijacked that it has on folks. But definitely, one of the things that I think about this, thinking about the way that is effectively anti-capitalism and anti-war, here in Boriken, is very difficult to see resistance as an armed struggle based on how everything is designed, as opposed to our history, how groups and national groups, independent groups, but also groups that were looking to comply, you know, the right of self-determination did. They use armed struggle. But now I see the possibility of just creating those safe spaces so to people have this, you know, so intimate dialogue, but also occupying spaces as a beacon of hope. And to some that can seem violent, but occupying spaces to feed your community, to create a space that is otherwise impossible to, you know, low income and community colors in Boriken, is kind of a way to, basically organize to create that energy justice that is so interconnected to so many rights. So I see that people see it as some squatters, but I see them as freedom fighters, because when you occupy a space and you defend it and your community is defending it, you are paving a way to another future, and you're paving a way to having energy and creating and developing energy with your own hands. And the energy justice approach can look very different. It doesn't really need to be connected to solar energy. It can look different, and using also nature to develop that energy. So yeah, I've seen a lot of wonderful things happening here in the archipelago. Reimagining energy, developing, creating energy with composting, imagining creating regenerate energy with water. So there's a lot of, you know, initiatives from below that have and are paving our hope, and of course, basically developing a radical love to land.
Patrick?
Yeah, thanks. I love what Vivian and Natalia had to share. Maybe my approach is a little bit more targeted in the context of this conversation. I think that many folks on this call are probably part of, you know, energy democracy or climate justice organizations, and every climate justice organization in the imperial core needs to have a conversation about Palestine if they have not already. And I hope that some of what you've heard on this call can help you have that conversation. As you know, both because it's important that we are all rowing in the same direction with the recognition that, I mean, I think a lot about something that Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, said about October 20th or so. He said that Palestine is a test case for what those in the Imperial Center consider surplus populations as the climate crisis intensifies. If we don't draw a line in the sand now and say that we're not going to abandon Palestine, then there's no telling where and who we will leave to sort of their own devices as the climate crisis intensifies. So this is an incredibly critical moment for the climate justice movement to stand up in internationalism and solidarity and to start having conversations about the role of militarism in the climate crisis more broadly. That means standing against Cop City in Atlanta. That means supporting land defenders domestically. That means supporting all manner of movements for sovereignty and self-determination across the global South, and reckoning, especially for those of us born and raised in the United States, with the responsibility that we have to democratize our energy system here at home and to support movements and self-determination for folks who want to do that and so much more around the world in places that we are, and I use we advisedly, contributing to, to get back to this land question, the occupation and dispossession of people around the world, indigenous or otherwise. So that is my call to action, I guess, is just talk to your people about Palestine and talk to them about why it's important that we make this stand now rather than trying to fight a kind of rearguard action later.
Thank you so much, everyone, for offering for these offerings. And the last question that we got, which we're not going to get to because of time, is thinking about unions and the roles that unions can play, and how to get them to be more progressive in their establishment of union culture. And I think something to think about with labor unions is the international global trade. Right? We've seen the way labor groups have been stepping up and stepping into calls to action for a ceasefire and making those relationships, building those relationships to stop these ships with weapons, to to stop and interrupt and disrupt global trade. As we see is really with capitalism is the driver. So, we've heard so much today about the ways in which occupation exists in Puerto Rico as well as Palestine, and the ways that our basic needs are being cut off, literally and metaphorically, severing the ties to the land. And we've heard also here today from folks about what's happening and what we can do. And so, as we're closing out today, not only is it important to remind us all to continue to bear witness, to continue to push the narrative of Palestine against the dehumanization that is happening, the gaslighting that is happening, the infliction of trauma that is happening across the world through words as well as through bombs. And so with that, I invite you all to drop in the chat, what's a skill that you want to bring? How do you want to contribute to this movement and building a thriving future? Because Refocus is about reimagining our futures. And we need to reimagine those futures together, because those futures are about community. Those futures are about the collective and rooted in Indigenous practices, as we've heard today. So how are we making that shift? How are we participating in the narrative? And how are we using ourselves, our bodies, to implement that future that we want, as well as in community? So I invite anyone else to drop in the chat, and any last comments as we have a few minutes left. I'm gonna just read what I'm seeing here in the chat, using my voice to bring Palestine into every single conversation. I want to keep this conversation going within the energy democracy, within energy justice and energy democracy spaces. So maybe holding circles virtually and in person. Keep talking about Palestine. Absolutely. Share what you've learned here today with others in your community. Learning to farm, garden, and save seeds. Vivian, I see you went off mute.
Oh, no, I was just thinking a lot about Patrick's point, which I think is a very important point to highlight and bring up and really leave with, which is, we talked about Boricua and Palestine today, but how important it is to remember that this is not just about Palestine. And I say this even as a Palestinian, but I'm also kin in the world with all of you and all other living beings that and that really this happening in Palestine and us allowing this, like almost not almost it's like I don't know, I don't watch TV much, but I know about these live shows, what do they call them, reality shows, that the war feels like a reality show, and how important it is to not allow that. So to also go back to the question, how do we combat capitalism and all of that, is how do we stay human in a world that's really forcing us and pushing us into a corner to become unhuman and or hybrid human. I think a lot of people are already there. But yeah, because this is about all of us, and the notion of nationalism, it's just very not only outdated, it's so violent. And when we talk about energy, when we talk about the climate, we are all living in the same earth and breathing the same air, and it's really high time for us to really take serious, not just notice, but serious action in really remembering that what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Congo, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Puerto Rico, what's happening everywhere is and what's happening in the streets here in New York is all very connected and in fact linked to each other.
Absolutely. Occupation looks different ways also, right? It's, when we're making this connection, I think something that y'all talked about was the neoliberal policies, right, of displacement. That is a form of occupation as well, when we talk about it in the U.S. context. And the interconnectedness between all of those, all of what is happening, the war machine, the and the energy machine as well. Selena and Natalia, I know we're at 3:29, so I want to give the floor to y'all.
Great. I'll just chime in really quick and would love Natalia to have the last words before we close off. But I would love to shine a spotlight, just metaphorically, not Zoom-wise, but shine a spotlight on all the energy justice advocates and activists that are here on this call, and really ask, why are there not more organizations having this conversation on a public space? And I shared this in the check-in call with the team last week, that the Energy Democracy Project is one of the first groups to be holding this sort of conversation in a public sphere. And that's not to share out of pride, it's really out of embarrassment. Embarrassment that it's taken us until January to have this sort of conversation. Embarrassment that we're still running into blocks and having these sort of conversation and treading lightly, feeling like we're walking on glass when we mention the topic of the genocide of Palestinians. And so let's really hold the mirror up and question ourselves. Why are we still running into blocks? So that we can continue doing this work, as Natalia said, really examine, starting individually, why and how we're showing up to this work so that we can come together collectively and bear the fruit that Palestinians all deserve. I'll pass it over to Natalia.
Thank you, Selena. And thank you again for this such powerful space. I think it was, for me, it was needed. I wanted to share a thought from Mohammed Nabulsi from Palestinian Youth Movement from the Houston chapter. This was shared with me and some community members in an event that I organized this last Saturday in solidarity with Palestine, but also that draws interconnection between Borican and Palestine and other Caribbean countries and nationalities. And yeah, I wanted to share it. He said, "Our liberation movement is only as strong as other liberation movements," which serves as a reminder that our liberation is bound to each other, as you all mentioned. And I think that's a very powerful thought that really stayed with me, and to really understand that every struggle is interconnected, and that we need to think and how to construct bridges and construct these grids of solidarity between us to pretty much dismantle and works towards true democracy that really, really gives representation to all.
Another big thank you to all of our speakers here today. We are so honored and blessed that y'all were able to make this call. Those of you who don't know, I mean, it just all worked out. Happened to, we got lucky. So just another big thank you. And as Selena said in the chat, y'all be signed up to the REFOCUS campaign updates as we continue to build the energy democracy movement forward, recognizing all of the global interconnected issues. Thank you all.
Peace, everyone. If we can get the panelists to stay and team to stay for just a moment.